Hey guys, Andy here at MPP Java. Welcome back to part 3 on my TestFX series. So in this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to create readable and maintainable functional JavaFX tests with TestFX. Now, this tutorial could also, be addressed to any testing API, not just TestFX. We're going to be covering some good design principles here, so it'll apply across the board. All right, so it's not going to take you long to figure out on your own after you write a couple of these functional tests, let's say after a couple of weeks, that maintainability and readability are going to be an issue. Specifically when these methods get long, or when you go back and you read your own methods maybe several weeks later, or somebody else goes, it's not immediately clear what's going on. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to address this problem early on so that you don't have to refactor a lot of your code afterwards. Okay, so we're going to be taking a look at a problem solution approach to this tutorial. I find that's the best approach to use to show what I want to show in this case, which is good design. The only way you're going to know what good design is if you see what bad design looks like. So first off, for those of you who have not seen part 1, I definitely suggest you look at part 1. Part 2 is not necessarily necessary for this since we just cover headless mode. But just to show you the application, to cover the whole audience here, I have a simplistic login screen here that when I log in, the main application loads up. It's a missions database, which I have a list of missions that once clicked on, you have a summary of that mission. So we're definitely going to want to test first off that the login works with the good username and password, and obviously bad username and passwords too that don't allow us to move on to the main view. The other thing we're going to want to test is in this console tab that clicking on one of these missions updates this text area here. And in the logger tab, we also want to test that once you click on one of these missions, that a message for that mission shows up, and that by clicking here, the logging area disappears, right? The text in the logging area disappears, clears it out. So in total, when you factor all those tests in, we have 8 tests that we want to do, okay? So in part 1 as well, I showed you these tests. And let's just build a project here. So on build, these tests are going to automatically run. And this is the exact same flow that's going to happen for the problem and the solution that I'm going to show. Okay, so you can see here I'm testing the login with a good login that showed the main screen. And now with some invalid logins, I tested the logger tab, the missions console tab. All of those come up with, I think, total 8 tests. Okay. So you can see here 8 tests were run. All right, so I covered that in part 1. Okay, so now we're all on the same ground. Let's take a look at how this is done in the project problem over here. So everything's going to be in test packages just like it was in part 1. And if you guys remember, the test base is where I encapsulate the functionality of TestFX's application test class, which gives us access to the test driver, right? That allows us to do the clicks and the drags and the drops and all that kind of stuff, all right? And I also have things in here that I would like all my tests to inherit, whether it is to run in headless mode, get access to the resource bundle, the stage, all that kind of stuff that I mentioned in part 1. So just wanted to reiterate there very quickly so that you're not surprised by seeing the test-based class in the other tests. So we've got 3 tests. We've got the login test, we've got the logger tab test, and we've got the missions tab test. So let's take a look at those. All right, let me bring those up. So if we take a look at the login test, I'm using JUnit params runner over here to run some parameterized tests because I don't want to copy paste, a whole bunch of tests and just provide different inputs when I'm doing invalid logins. All right, so JUnit params dependency is being used in the pond.xml file. You guys should already know about that. It's a very mature API. It's been out there for a long time. So over here, I've got my JavaFX IDs that I put into some constants. So for better readability and maintainability in here. And over here, I've got my login with success test. Now, if we take a look at this test, we'll see that we're clearing out some input fields. If we go take a look at that method at the bottom over here, you'll notice that all I'm doing is I'm erasing the text by using the driver over here. I'm clicking on some fields, erasing them. Then after I do that, I click on the username field, I write the valid username and password, click on the button, and then I assert what I have to assert, mainly that the main application title shows up and that it is showing, okay? So what's the problem here, right? Because this is the problem project. The problem is that we have a mixing of concerns here. If we just take a look at maintainability as point number one, we'll notice that we're directly involved in a couple of things. We're directly involved in interacting with the driver, right? The driver has to interact with the UI components and has to write and has to do every little thing, mechanically speaking, right? Very low level driver stuff in order for us to get to our expected state that we want to assert. So we've got this kind of mixing of concerns in there. I'd like to, encapsulate that or put that in another object, which I'm going to show you in the solution. So that's a problem, because for maintainability, if I want to change later on how my login screen looks like, for example, I want to add perhaps some check boxes, I want to add some radio buttons, or I want to change the text field into a combo box, which will allow you to select like predetermined usernames or something like that, or some that have already been entered in history, then this is going to change, right? And so I'm going to have to always go back to my tests, and all the tests, here's the unsuccessful login, kind of looking the same over here, where I'm clicking on the same kind of things in writing, except this time I'm writing the wrong username and password because I'm using a parameterized test, right? Passing in the wrong username and password here. I'm also having to find my elements manually. So there's a mixing of concerns here, and as soon as I start moving things from one scene to another, or even renaming things, deleting things, maybe adding a new section that'll allow me to have some more selection options, these tests are going to have to get changed. Okay, now in my simplistic user interface, I only have two tests right here. But you can imagine if this was like, and in the real world it will be, 5 times as long, that this is going to become a maintenance nightmare later on. So this is the point of my tutorial, is catch this on early. Like in this case, the application is kind of young, it hasn't grown, it hasn't evolved very much. So it's best to incorporate the solution that I'm going to show you while refactoring is practical right now. Okay, so here's the login test. Now in terms of readability, the second point that I want to address is that this doesn't necessarily read like a story, right? You have to actually really follow the flow here, all these little low-level mechanical flows, to find out and visualize what exactly is going on. We're not executing some service or some action method here that is self-descriptive, okay? So that's definitely a problem. And if ever someone comes back later on and reads your test, again, imagine this being longer and more involved because your GUI is more complex, then it's going to be much harder for them to get up to speed with what exactly is going on in this test in order to later on maintain it. Okay, so readability, these functional tests should read like little stories. Okay, again, just make sure that when you're doing with tests should have asserts, and everything else should be put into some separate objects, what I'm going to show you. So the other tests over here, the logger tab test, is actually something I want to raise, is that when you're doing these tests, for say with the logger tab or the missions tab that I showed you, you don't want to have to log into the application every single time to perform every test, right? That's kind of a waste of time, slows the functional test down. They're already very long as it is. And so we want to bypass the login screen. So what I've done here in the before each test method, I've overridden the one that is inherited in the test-based class. And I'm basically saying I want to not use the main.class, which is inherited, right? I want to use the main without login.class. If we go take a look at that, it's basically just overriding the method display initial scene from the main class, and I'm switching the scene to the main right away. Because if you go take a look at the main class that I showed you guys in part 1, and again, there's nothing wrong, we could go check that out right now anyhow, you'll notice that in here, if I go take a look at display initial scene, I'm displaying the login one, and I want to bypass that. So I'm using my stage manager, which I showed you how to use with Spring in switching scenes like a boss in my tutorial on how to do that. and I'm just overriding it. So now I just want to test the main, so bypass that. So that'll really speed up test and simplify my test too, because you're not going to have code in there that says, okay, go do a successful login and then do, you know, these tests over here. So I want to ensure a clear log button clears the log area. So again, I'm very involved in, you know, the driver details of clicking on the Skylab mission in the list, moving to the tab, clicking on it, clicking on the clear button, and then asserting the state. So I'm very involved in all the actions that lead up to the state that I want to test. I should just be able to call a service method that will get me access to the state and then assert that, okay? But that's not what's going on here. And you can see here there's a little bit of duplication code as well from here to here. So this sometimes is unavoidable and sometimes it is, but what happens is usually in test code, I see that people don't necessarily use that mantra mercilessly refactor as they would do in their own you know, production-based code. So again, unfortunately, because of that, the maintainability will be harder when the time comes. Okay, and the missions tab test is perhaps, you know, the simplest one, because again, my GUI is pretty simple. I'm just ensuring selecting a mission displays that mission in the overview section. So I click on the list, I click on the mission type, and I assert it. Now going back to the logger tab test, do I have any more tests there? No, I just had those two tests, right? The logger tab updates when the mission file is selected and ensure the clear log button clears the log area. All right, so the kind of things I showed you when I showed you the application. All right, so now that you've seen the kind of code that you may be already writing and the code that I actually covered in part 1, let's see how we can make this better after I've already outlined the problems that are apparent there. Okay, so let me close up that one. This is just a copy paste of the project with the good code in there. So first off, you'll notice that I created a pages directory, and the reason why is because the solution is going to incorporate using the PageObject pattern. What the PageObject pattern is, now in my case here I have 3 pages. Let's take a look at the login page. The login page, the logger page, and the missions page. So let me talk first on the PageObject pattern. The PageObject pattern is there to encapsulate all that low-level driver code, right? You want to encapsulate it like that. And also it's there for you to supply service methods or action methods, if you will, that'll allow your tests to use them so they're more readable and maintainable, because the details will be hidden in there, they'll be abstracted away in there, and the mechanics will be hidden as well. So whether you go from a text box to a drop-down list box when you want to enter the username, it's not going to make a difference anymore in your tests, because now I'm going to have a login action method that's going to be called. Okay, and all you're going to have to do is pass in the username and the password, and what's going to happen is I'll take care of those details. So I take care of clearing out the input fields in here. I enter the username, I enter the password. Notice that these are kind of fluent action methods, right? Because every method returns the this reference. So it'll read more like a story when you're actually executing this in your test. Now, you could actually, you know, because this is public, go and enter the username directly, but I have a sort of helper method here that just does the whole thing for you. So you'll notice the clicking is all hidden in here. When you submit, the click on, the finding is hidden in here as well. It's all the low-level details are in there. And also, there is no asserts in here. You could have asserts in here. Some people like to put their asserts in here. I am not one of them. I like to put my asserts in my tests and the driver code and all that action-based methods in here. Now, I mentioned the word service calls. You could actually come up here and implement a method. Okay, not implement a method, implement an interface rather, excuse me. And then that'll allow you to kind of shield yourself even further from change if the driver changes or something like that, okay? Or wrap the driver methods in some interface methods. But in this case, I didn't do that. I didn't want to complicate the example too much, but I opted instead to mention it. Every object page should also make sure it's testing the right page, right? Or the right view. So in this case here, because it's a login page, I want to make sure that I'm testing the login page. Make sure, right? Makes sense, right? So here I'm just getting the primary stage from the test-based class, and I'm just trying to match it against the resource bundles key login.title. And if it's not, I throw in a legal argument exception. Okay, so make sure you do something like that. It'd be nice to actually even put this as a sort of inherited method in your test-based class, because you're kind of going to see this code, come up in every single page. Again, I didn't do it in the tutorial because I want to show you right in there. So let us go now and take quickly at the logger page tab. Notice that every constructor takes in the class test-based, because the test-based class gives you access to the TestFX driver, right? That allows you to do the clicking and all that kind of stuff, right? So I save it as a reference, and then that's what I use to do all those low-level mechanics and stuff like that. So if I want to press the clear button, how I do that, you don't know, right? It's all encapsulated in this page. Missions page is the same thing. I have some pretty nice methods in here. I can select any mission. So any mission right now, I just put a default mission of shuttle, but you can come up with a different implementation on that. Let me remove this comment. You always remove commented code. Select mission, select logger tab. You'll notice that the select logger tab in this case returns another page. So page objects cannot, they don't have to just return themselves, right? This reference, they can return other page objects to simulate a user's flow in your GUI. They could also return, in this case, specific state. Right? This is all stuff that we want in our tests. We want to assert state eventually. We want to mimic flows. We want the we want the test to read well, like stories. So all the combination of these three things that I just showed you is going to help in the readability of your tests. Okay? So let's see how to use these now in our tests. First things first. Now this is not part of the page object pattern, but I decided to create a class called JavaFX IDs, and here is where I put all my JavaFX IDs, and I put them in some constants. I find this is much better than putting them all separately in all the tests. Better for maintainability. You group them together. If you ever rename something, it's much easier to change it here. Okay, so I prefer this method. Let's go take a look at our login test. So the login test over here, if you take a look, I'm still using JUnit params. Over here, I have a login page reference, which I instantiate in my before each test method over here. That's going to get executed, obviously, before each test, right? And I pass in the this reference, because the this reference is basically going to hold the TestFX driver in the test-based class, right? And now, if I want to do a login test, login with success, you'll notice that I'm using the page, and I'm just saying .login now. I am not involved in all the mechanics, the low-level details. And then the rest of the code is the same. It's the same thing with the unsuccessful login. I'm just providing the login action method again, passing in bad username and passwords via that parameterized test. So much less code to maintain. If again, I had to change, move, rename, delete any of these UI components or the actions that would lead up to that state, I would be safe here, okay? Let's go take a look at the missions tab test. So the missions tab test follows the same flow, right? In this case here, I want to test without the login. I showed you that before. I get my missions page. In this case, I'm just saying my test saying ensure selecting mission displays overview. Okay, so I use my mission page. I say select any mission. I get the this reference back. Then I say get the selected mission that was selected out of all those missions. So I get my state back, and that's exactly what I want. I don't care how it's done, right? Just give me my state for the action that I want, right? Through this action method called select any mission, and then I can do my TestFX asserts on those like I showed you in part 1, okay? So that's, like I said, a simplistic test over here. The best one that reads the best in this example is the logger tab test, okay? So the logger tab test in my demo shines the brightest here. So again, instantiate the emissions page. Here we want to ensure clearing the log button clears the log area. So here I go in my story, right? It reads like a story. Mission page, I'll select any mission. Now select the logger tab. Like I said, a page object can return another page object, and that's exactly what's going on here, right? To mimic the flow. So I get my logger page object back, and I press the clear button. And then I assert that it's empty, the text. You see how easy that is to read? Don't really have much to read there, and it flows nicely. The other one is logger tab updates when mission file is selected. So again, same kind of stories going on over here. Select the logger tab in this case, and when you select the logger tab, the text in there will become available, and then you can actually get the text and make sure it contains the selected mission info. So reads nice, very maintainable. This is how you should be going in this direction from now on. Again, notice that these tests have your asserts in there, okay? And the asserts are not in your page objects. Now, just to clear up the kind of the misnomer of the page object pattern, in my example, I was testing 2 tabs in the login page, right? So I have like 3 page objects, but it doesn't have to be one view to one page, right? Or one scene to one page, or whatever technology, whatever terms you're using. In this case, I did that because my view is simplistic. But you can have, let's say, in a view, different sections that you've organized your flows in, right? And so every section, logical section that the user would use to accomplish a certain task could become its own page object. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's just that I did not do that in this tutorial. So I hope that really helps you guys clean up your functional tests by using the page object pattern. Seeing the problem, identifying it, and using the solution will really improve your design. I'm positive. And thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe so you can get a hold on the next tutorials coming out. And until next time, ciao.